Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AA Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Sharon Dunlevy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aaron. It's nice to be on here.
Absolutely. Why don't you start off by just telling my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Sharon Dunlevy, and I live in the Indianapolis area, and I'm an educational advocate for children in foster care. Kind of came to this a little bit of a roundabout way. My background actually is in special education, and there was a licensing agency in the Indianapolis area that was looking for an educational advocate for the children that they licensed, and basically wanting somebody who could work with the kids, work with the schools, knew the education laws that were wrapped around these kids.
Sure.
And so I had the background, and that kind of, I crossed over into that child welfare world. Did that about 7 years ago and haven't left. And so what I do is I have a graduate certificate in education law, and I specifically focused on those laws that work with children in foster care, like the Every Student Succeeds Act, Individuals with Disabilities Act, and then there is a law under the Social Security Act that's called Family First Prevention Services Act. And so I really make sure that foster parents know about those laws and how to make sure that the kids in their care are getting the support they need in the school systems in order for them to succeed.
That's awesome. I love that. My first question is, what is your definition of inclusion?
Yes. So for me, like I said, my background's in special education. And actually, I was a children's minister for 20 years, and I left formal ministry, to serve out in the public because of the question of inclusion. I had a real hard time getting the church to understand that we should be embracing people with disabilities, people with differences, rather than not including them into what we did as a church. And so I couldn't do that anymore. I needed to work with people where they were and open those doors for them so that they could have the same opportunities that everybody else has. And I guess that's what inclusion means to me. We talk a lot about white privilege and all of this. And what that comes down to is there are people out there that do not have the same opportunities that we have to succeed. And we're kind of blind to that. And so I really want to work with people and get them to understand that there are those that are forgotten out there, that they're not able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps because they don't have those opportunities to even try and do that. So inclusion for me is not just opening doors, but it is inviting them in, having them at the table, having their voices be heard. Just because somebody has a developmental disability does not mean they don't have the mental capacity to think thoughtfully and create policy and other things like that. So that's what inclusion means to me.
Yeah, I love that. Can you maybe, I think I have a idea of what like foster care is and the foster care system is. Could you briefly maybe go into like explaining what foster care, what that means, and like some of the circumstances that would lead a child to end up in the foster care system?
Yes, and that's a great question, Aaron, because foster care, everybody has, like when they hear that word, they have some type of image, right? That pops into their head, and some of it's negative. So children enter foster care for a lot of reasons. And some of them are what we hear like in the news and in the media and TV shows. Yes, their parents were drug addicts or alcoholics. Yes, they were possibly abusive. That is definitely a piece of foster care. But there are other children who end up in foster care for reasons that are a little more subtle. And there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of race and all this. But just quickly, things like poverty. Our system is set up in such a way, or our country is set up in such a way that rather than helping a family in poverty get out of poverty, we often remove their kids. And so then poverty becomes an obstacle. and then it becomes another. It builds on each other. On itself. So parents who want to get their kids back, they're having to attend court dates and things like that, and they're missing work. So then they miss work, they get fired, and they remain in poverty. Things like transportation. Other reasons that they may be removed, educational neglect is a big one. Schools are often aware of who is in their district that should be going to school and are not.
Right.
And so educational neglect becomes a big issue. Again, if we had some front end things that would help them, maybe they wouldn't end up in the system. Maybe we could have helped them. But right now, our foster care system does end up being a lot of some of those things. There and a lot of it does, like I said, there's a lot of racial things that come into play. Definitely more children of color are removed than white children. There seems to be a higher standard set for children of color than for white children, but overall, there's just a lot of things, and some of these things are things that could happen to anybody. For example, I had a mother who had a child because her husband passed away, and they went into poverty, and so things that could happen to anyone could cause somebody to lose their children.
Right. What about as far as what about are there enough like foster parents for the number of kids in the foster care system, or what does that look like?
Absolutely not. So right now we have about 400,000 children in foster care nationwide, and we have probably 1/3 of that number of families who are taking children. Now, some families can take 2. But most states will not let you take 3 or more children unless you have like a special license.
Okay.
So, we're not meeting that need at all.
Right.
America does not use foster like orphanages and all of that as much. We don't use that group home model as much. But especially since COVID, we've had to move back to that model because there aren't enough foster parents, and especially after COVID. So there is definitely a need for foster parents. Sure. And I guess I should have said that at the beginning when we were talking about what foster care is. The foster parents have to go through a lot of training. I know there's this idea out there that they do this to make money. Trust me, they're not making money. They don't get enough to cover the living cost of the children in their home. Okay. They are doing this because they love the kids. And so they do have to go through quite a rigorous set of training to become a foster parent and then to remain a foster parent. So one of the things that I do is I actually train foster parents in all sorts of different areas in order for them to maintain their licenses.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So I don't know if you know a percentage, but like how many children that are in foster care like have IEPs and stuff?
So based on their trauma, a lot of kids have developmental delays. Trauma really does affect your body physically and your brain physically, not just mentally. And so what we've learned is that the brain development is, it shrinks. The brain actually shrinks. Our brains shrink and grow based on experiences, negative and positive. Mm-hmm. And negative experiences will cause that brain to tighten in. And you'll see that children who have trauma often are very much stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Yep. And that's something that you have to overcome. So based on that trauma, about 80% of children in foster care should qualify for an IEP. Now, one of the things that I do is I go into the schools and fight for that IEP because schools sometimes don't want to include, and there is no real definition of trauma in the IEP process. So I help parents go navigate that system by going under the other health impairments category, which includes like PTSD, ADD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct defiant disorder, all of those. And I help those kids get those IEPs that they need. But about 80% would qualify for an IEP.
Okay. That's pretty high.
Very high.
I mean, I guess it doesn't surprise me, but that is pretty high, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So one of the jobs I've had is I worked at a residential treatment facility, mental health treatment facility for adolescents in my hometown. So it was a place where they come to stay for a period of time. I mean, I don't know the numbers of kids that were there, like in foster care or, like wards of the state or that situation, but there definitely were kids that were there like that. And part of that, is you kind of, with the word foster care, I mean, sometimes, like we've talked about a little bit, there's like preconceived ideas, or, they're in foster care, they're possibly, they're not all bad, but you kind of get the label thing. And I don't necessarily like labels. My daughter has a disability. She's in special ed. So my view is we needed like the quote unquote label to get her the services that she needs to be successful in school. But then it like stays with her and you can't really get rid of it.
Yes.
Which, and then, the next teacher, the next year sees the label, they have some preconceived ideas about what, she can and cannot do. So I feel like it's probably similar with like if once a kid is in foster care or, has that attached to them, I'm assuming they kind of have those preconceived ideas that kind of move with them as well.
Yes. And in fact, there are, if you ever watch, like there's some videos on YouTube and stuff like that of children who have been in foster care who talk about their experiences in school.
Right.
And one of the things they talk about is that label. Right. Many of them don't want to be known as foster kids, right? They don't want their friends to know. They don't want their teachers to know. Unfortunately, the teachers have to know in order to get them the help that they need. Like you said, those labels serve a purpose, even though they also brand the child. But several of these kids will tell you that they don't feel like they're understood. As soon as somebody knows they're in foster care, there's a preconceived notion. So I can tell you a story, and I'm going to call him Jim just because it's a student that I've worked with, and I really shouldn't share his name, but I'll call him Jim. And when Jim came to our foster licensing agency, he had been in residential since like 4 years old till 9th grade. And he came out at 9th grade, was placed in one of our best foster homes, fabulous family. But the school didn't want to enroll him because, Aaron, in residential, when kids are around other kids who have violent tendencies, they're going to become violent. I mean, it's a horrible situation because they just feed off of each other. Well, he was violent because he had to, like he was telling me, he had to hide his snacks in like the ceiling tiles because otherwise they're going to be stolen. So, he had some violent tendencies in residential, but that wasn't who he was. And as soon as he was out of there, he was a whole different kid. But his IEP said he had anger issues. He had violence issues. He had all these issues. It took the foster parents and I all summer long to convince this school to take him and let him enroll. Once he got in there, he was great. I mean, he had periods where he'd get mad and he'd mouth off and stuff, but he never got into fights. He never did any of that. That was that label that followed him, like you said. So foster kids a lot of times just don't want to be known as a foster kid for that reason. But they'll also tell you that if they don't reveal that they're foster kids, then they're being marked off when they have to go to a court date and they miss school. It's considered an unexcused absence. They're missing a lot of classroom time. So then when anybody who's ever seen kids in school and have had issues, you get penalized for things like that. So all of a sudden, they're missing classroom time. So now they're in suspended. Well, what's the point? You're suspending them. You're taking them out of school, missing school. That some of the punishments don't make sense, but it also is to the detriment of the kids. So they don't like those labels. And it's hard though, because what do you call your foster parents? Do you call them mom and dad? Do you call them by their first name? Do you call them like Mr. and Mrs.? Well, that right there then labels them, right? Anytime they're introducing somebody. This kid, Jim, that I was telling you about, he was a white child in a black household. There was no way for him to pretend like those were his parents. So, I things that people don't think about, but yes, those labels just come with them. One of the things that a lot of us advocates for children in foster care is kind of like what you said, when you hear the word foster care with kids, one of the things people think of is, oh, they're bad kids. That child never did anything to be put into foster care. Right? That's not their fault. we're judging the kids based on where they are rather than the parents or the system or something else. Those kids are victims.
Yes.
Whether they would deserve to be in foster care or not, they're victims. And they don't want to be treated like victims, but they want to be understood. Just
Right.
like anybody else with any other difference or disability. They want to be understood
Yep.
and accepted for who they are and not what somebody else did that got them where they are.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what you said about they pick up, if they're in residential, they pick up doing stuff that they didn't do before. That is so true. I mean, there's so many, I have tons of examples of a kid didn't do something or X, and then he gets in there and all of a sudden everybody else around them is doing X, and all of a sudden they're starting to do it. And it's like, but I mean, the behavior, I try to understand what was happening, because when you hear some of the stories of the kids, I mean, if you're 5 years old in a residential and hear what their background was, it's like I couldn't be able to function in my life. Could have been gone through all the stuff this kid's gone through in his first 5 years of life. So it's just they pick up the behaviors to be able to survive and make it to the next day. I mean, they're just figuring out their survival, how to survive stuff. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
What factors lead to positive educational outcomes for students in foster care?
That's a great question, Erin. So there are several factors, and this is something that, again, like I teach our foster parents, but obviously school stability is the biggest factor. And Every Student Succeeds Act that was enacted in 2016 has kind of helped address that. Before 2016 and ESSA, we call it ESSA, it's Every Student Succeeds Act, but ESSA. Before that was enacted, children could have gone to, I had one that had gone to like 23 different schools by the time she graduated. I'm a military brat and I didn't go to that many schools, right? 23 different schools. That's crazy to me. They're moving in the middle of the years, they're missing days. They're all of these things. So educational stability was the biggest issue.
Yep.
And so under ESSA, if a student is placed in a new home, they can stay in what they call their school of origin, the school that they were in, even if it's out of district, and they have to provide transportation for that student. So that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that was happening with foster kids is if they did have to change schools were not enrolling them right away. They wanted their medical records. They wanted them all these records. Well, sometimes those records are not there. They're just not there. Foster parents don't have them from the bio parents or whatever. There's a lack of those records. And so now under ESSA, schools have to enroll that student immediately, regardless of status of records. They cannot delay. There's a 1-day turnaround, which is fantastic, right? Like
that's great.
Those kids in school, the more time they miss in those classrooms, the more time they're falling behind. So those were the two biggest things that ESSA covered. But there's some things that are still kind of on the edge that really help that we need to do better at. And the biggest one is trauma-informed personnel. You work with students or families who have children with disabilities. You've experienced this within your own child. Children with disabilities often have trauma because of the way the world perceives them.
Right.
And we don't always look at that. The other thing is, since probably about 9/11, 2001, there has been a growing number of incidents where children who have no other, they're not suffering from neglect, they're not suffering from abuse, but they're exposed to trauma because of things like 9/11, because of school shootings, COVID, the mental health toll of COVID is just barely being talked about now, barely being talked about. So kids have trauma. They're exposed to so much via social media. When we were growing up, we didn't hear, we heard a little bit about these things, but it was always distance, right? It wasn't in our backyard. Kids are terrified to go to school today because they know any school could have a school shooting. You can't predict it. And so trauma-informed personnel needs to be a big push. And what that looks like is trauma punishments, quote unquote, don't work. So if somebody has trauma, you were talking about that 5-year-old who's in residential. I had a 5-year-old that I worked with. He kept getting in trouble in school. He was an attention seeker. He wanted attention. He wanted somebody to love him and like him. And he was such a cutie. But he got in trouble in school. And for some reason, they put this 5-year-old in a empty classroom by himself. Now, that was wrong on the school's part all the way around. By the time somebody came to check on him, he had trashed that classroom. Pulled things off the wall, broke the phone. I mean, trashed the classroom. And they're like, why? Why would he do this? Well, it took a while, but when we talked to him, the last time that had happened to him, he was in preschool, and he and his sister had been put into this classroom by themselves. And then they were separated, and they had not seen each other again since. They went to 2 different foster homes.
Yeah.
So, understanding what triggers people into that fight, flight, or freeze mode is really important, because you can't do timeouts. You can't do suspensions. You can't just keep sending them to the principal's office. It's a whole different culture that you build if you have trauma-informed personnel. And there are schools out there that do this, and they do it well. And we need to make this much more universal. Other things that help kids for educational outcomes, as they get older, we need to be focusing on college and career readiness. We need to be focusing on living independently. And children in foster care especially struggle with that, because once they age out, they're out. There's no adult. Like, my kid is 23 years old. They live in the basement because it's too expensive to live on their own right now. They have a mom and dad that can take care of them. A lot of these kids don't. Or they end up going back to those parents that abused them, that used drugs, that used alcohol. How many of them have come back to those parents and fallen into drugs and alcohol themselves? The other thing is, there's a high number of former foster kids who their own kids end up being in the system at some point. The removal, it's a cycle. It's a cycle.
Right.
So we really need to focus on those independent living skills. Our kids can't live with us for the rest of our lives. They need to be able to take care of themselves, but they don't have the skills. And right now, with schools being so focused on testing, they can't even think to add in those pieces of learning, So those are the things that I really focus on.
Those are great things. So the foster care are they out of it as soon as they turn 18, or how does that happen?
No, thank goodness. It used to be that way. It did. It used to be that way. And that's where that Family First Prevention Services Act comes in. What they found was kids were aging out at 18 and couldn't do anything. We know our brains are not fully developed until the age of 25. That's brain science has proven that. 18, that's 7 years before their brain is fully developed. So originally, Family First extended help and services to age 21. Then they went to 23, and now they're up to 26 for certain functions. So depending on each state and how they enact it, the children can stay in what's called like collaborative care, or there's bridges programs, transition programs from that 18 to whichever age. They have to offer up to 23. They can offer up to 23.
Okay.
So like Indiana, we offer services all the way up to 23. Now, in order to use those services, they have to elect to, which is, we know young adults, they don't always want help. But like my friend Jim that I was telling you about, he elected to, and he stayed all the way to 23. He is a manager at Domino's. I mean, he's doing fantastic, right? So because he knew that he needed to do that. But they can also get training vouchers and career vouchers, like in order to have vocational education and stuff, all the way up to the age of 26, which is
awesome.
That's great. Yeah.
So I mean, would you consider Indiana like more on the pro foster care advanced side of things? Then is that kind of
it's funny because we joke a lot about Indiana's not always the most
Yeah.
Forward thinking, but we do have a pretty good foster care system. Yeah, we've had some really good directors of foster care who have done some really good things,
Sure.
have put some great programs in place. Now, is there room for improvement? Absolutely. You talked about, the lack of foster parents. Since COVID, there has been a huge, well, even before COVID, but really since COVID, there's a huge lack of child welfare workers nationwide. So, and there is an issue with mental health providers who work with teens. That's another gap. So there's two big gaps, and that's nationwide.
Yep.
There's going to have to be some concerted effort on all the states' parts to get caught up with that. But in terms of laws and things, Indiana's not bad. There's always something more they can do, but they're
Absolutely.
not.
Yep.
Yeah, they definitely do pretty well compared to some other states that I have talked to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can foster parents advocate for the educational needs of students in their care?
So they need to know the laws, which is what I teach. So I have a contract with the state of Ohio, and part of their foster parent training is they have a requirement that these foster parents take educational advocacy classes, and that's what I teach. I teach those for them. So I teach them those laws. They need to know the laws. They need to know how to talk to the schools about what the rights are of those children.
Yep.
And when I teach, I give them those laws. I give them the actual writing that their states have provided on what those rights are. How do you advocate for it? So I make sure those are in their hands. I encourage foster parents to teach independent living skills at home. And this is true for any parent. I mean, it's not just foster parents.
Yep.
Teach your kids. You can teach your kids independent living skills as babies. I mean, there are giving them that sense to be able to try and do things on their own when they're little, rather than constantly coming up behind them and hovering. But just, tiny things, chores. I'm not a huge fan of paying for chores. There should be certain chores that every child should have to do because they're part of the family. And then there can be other chores that maybe they do extra that they could get paid for.
Sure.
But having that sense of responsibility, get them out and active in the community, connect them to other people, just the library, some type of religious organization, anything to get them volunteering, anything to get them outside, working with others, seeing people, getting a sense of compassion. We don't teach compassion anymore.
Right.
And those are things that they can do. So some of these things you're thinking, well, this doesn't have anything to do with education. But education is all about preparing our kids to be adults and to be successful, useful adults, right? And so that's what we need to be doing when they're in our homes, is we need to be teaching them these skills on how to succeed in life without us, knowing that they're going to eventually be on their own and have families of their own. So those are things that they can do. Other things that they can do to advocate for the needs of their kids is maybe maybe being part of the PTO or PTA at your school. Things where you can have some say in how the school culture is. Run for school board. Even if you're not elected. I ran for school board. I wasn't elected.
Yeah.
But I kind of broke through a little barrier here in our little town, because before I ran for school board, every member on that school board had been there for 20 plus years. I ran for school board. I didn't get elected, but now our school board has completely changed, because since I broke the ice, other people ran, and now it's changed. So things like that you can do, get your kids active, get yourself active, be a community leader, speak out, be the ones that people can turn to for understanding about what the children in foster care need.
Yeah, that's great. As you were talking, I'm due. So do foster parents, they have legal custody and physical custody of the children, or how does, what's the legal side of it as far as the child in their care?
They do. The children are considered wards of the state, but the foster parents are licensed and paid by the state, so they are the legal custodians of the children. It's interesting. I've got a group of people I talk to who are in England, And they were like, why do you call them foster parents? They're not parents. And I'm like, yeah, they are. I mean, they have the same parental rights as any other parent in the US. In England, they don't. They're considered carers, but they don't have parental rights. But here, yes, they have parental rights. So things like IEP meetings. Now, some states, the way that they word it, it might be a little different. Like Ohio, they want the foster parents to take a special class called educational surrogacy, just so that they can be like the educational surrogate for that kid. But they are basically have those parental rights of the kids.
In your experience, I mean, I'm obviously, I have kids that are by blood my kids, and then do you see any like are foster parents treated like differently for the child that they're taking care of versus like a birth parent with their children? Do you see any like differences like that?
Yes, yes, definitely. And it just, again, it depends. So what I find is as I'm talking with foster parents and like I said, this goes state to state, district to district. Some schools seem to be a little more understanding of what the foster care system is and what the foster parent's role is. Other schools don't. Like I've had some in Ohio that have told me that, yeah, I go to the meeting and I can't even, or they'll enroll the kid and they can't even get into like the online grading system. Like they won't give them that access.
Sure.
Well, how are they supposed to make sure the kid's doing well if they can't see their grades?
Yeah.
You know, so then and I always just tell them, I said, well, if they want to just give it to your child services, family case manager, whatever they call them, just make sure you get it from them. But really, they need to be treated that way. But sometimes you just don't understand. People don't understand.
Sure.
And it also gets confusing if a child is on the road to adoption. That's one thing, but if they're just in foster care temporarily and the bio parents or the parents of birth are involved in the case because they're working to get the children back, then that becomes a different thing. And really, it should be a partnership between the foster parents and those bio parents. But sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I didn't even think about that aspect because if you're trying to get them reunited with birth parents, and then you go to an IEP meeting, you could have the foster parents there, maybe the birth parents, and then you get like a bunch of stuff happening. So.
Yeah, and I think they should all be there because foster parents know the kids right then, but the birth parents need to know if they're coming. These kids are coming back. The school needs to know them. They need to know what's going on, and they should be involved. So, yeah.
Can you want to share a little bit about like services you provide or how people can reach out to you and what kind of help you provide and stuff?
Sure. So the best way to reach out to me is through LinkedIn. I'm also on Facebook. And if you just search Sharon Dunlevy, you'll find me in either place. You can see on my screen, I just written this paper and I'm getting ready to send it out to all the states. I'm trying to get state contracts to do more teaching like I do for Ohio or even writing curriculum for a state on how to do educational advocacy, those types of things. So, but yeah, definitely find me on Facebook or LinkedIn, Sharon, SHARON, Dunlevy, DUNLEVY. You'll find me and connect with me because I would love to have conversations with people. Any conversation, just to kind of what can we do? What can we do to make this system better for our kids?
That's great. What is one tip you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? So just something simple. You don't have to spend money or like go to school to learn it. Just something simple you can start today to be more inclusive.
Think about your own biases. That's what my tip is. We all have biases. I consider myself to be very open-minded, but I will tell you, somebody says something, somebody looks a certain way, and I automatically have a thought in our head. Be aware of that. Be aware that we all have biases, no matter how hard we try to break them, and catch yourself. Why are you having this bias? And what does that really say about the other person? Are you judging other people because of an unspoken bias in your head rather than the reality of who that person is?
Yeah, I love that because we all do. Yeah, we all have that. So you need to think, why is this thought coming into my head? Why am I thinking this way about that person? That's great. Ready for the last question?
Sure.
You like Spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
No,
No.
that's too funny.
Yeah, so I live in Austin, Minnesota, where Hormel is located, where they make Spam, and where the Spam Museum is located. So I've been asking all my guests just to
That's
see.
too funny. My mom grew up in Hawaii, and I don't know if you know this, but
Yep.
Spam is a
Yep.
huge thing in Hawaii in their ramen. So,
Yeah.
I actually grew up with Spam,
Okay.
but it's not my favorite. But I don't like
Gotcha.
any processed meats.
There you go. Yeah, I actually told my partner last night after I did an interview, like I should be keeping track from the beginning how many people mention Hawaii in their answer, because it's the number of people that have experienced Spam because they went to Hawaii or knew somebody that was from Hawaii, and so it's interesting how it that much connection. But so I live where the Spam Museum is located. So if you want to visit it, it's actually kind of cool. I've been there. There's a lot of history, a lot of cool backstory to it. So yeah,
I'll have to tell my husband that. See, we always look for fun new things to do together. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm so glad you reached out to me and invited me on.
Absolutely.
This has been fantastic.
To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.